Hi, I'm Janie, and I am reviewing Megan's paper. Megan doesn't have a title for her paper, but it is on terrorism mainly. She's described how the United States views terrorism primarily through the prism of events of 9/11, when in fact terrorism has global origins that are complex and span multiple religions and nationalities. She goes on to examine the widely accepted perception that terrorism is purely rooted in Islamic fundamentalism, and she cites examples and misconceptions about it in the broader context of global affairs and the teachings of the Quran. Towards the end, she suggests ways of interpreting terrorism's root causes as a way of preventing it in the future. Overall, I thought she was really successful in proving how it's wrong that terrorism is categorized as a simple matter of us versus them. I think terrorism is definitely a really difficult topic because of the deeply ingrained effects of 9/11. So I think you had a big undertaking here, but I think you did really well. My main critique would be just like in these you provide like good evidence of like the ideas and concepts related to the problem of terrorism, but I think that you could have some stronger like evidentiary like talking about more current events and stuff like that. I think that could really help you. And I have some for you that you can choose to use or not to use if you don't want to. Yeah, so she's referring to international incidents of terrorism, Boko Haram, domestic terrorists, Timothy McVeigh. She listed those to show that terrorism happens in different religious and social contexts. Um, She opens by saying that we all remember 9/11 as a defining act of terrorism in our lifetimes, but not many think the same way of Boko Haram kidnappings or Timothy McVeigh's bombing of the government building on Oklahoma. I think that one piece that I liked the most that we've covered this topic was like from the first week. It was the Galtung interview. He talks about I can't pronounce this guy's name, Anders Breivik, who was the anti-Muslim Norwegian militant who like killed 77 people because he was mad that the Norwegian government is promoting multiculturalism. He talks, or Galtung talks about that in this interview, and he also talks about like kind of his how he's interacted with Taliban and like his understanding of the situation in Afghanistan. And I think that that could really benefit you, especially on that paragraph that you said that you had proposed to write. You said you wanted to go a little bit more into like historical context of that region. I think that's what you want to, but I think that this interview could help you a lot. All kind of without just reading word for word his interview, I'll go through this and maybe tell you some of the stuff that I thought could help you the most. Let's see, yeah. So he opens by talking about the Anders Breivik, this man who has these deep rooted motivations behind his all his killings in Judeo-Christian mythology. He was really angry at the multiculturalism and like the within Norway, and Galtung draws a parallel between Breivik killings and the Norwegian government killing of Afghans, which is kind of like a little bit of like a side note, but it's important to see that Galtung is pointing out these acts of terrorism that we don't really see as terrorism. Like the Norwegian government killing Afghans in Afghanistan, we see that as a defense strategy or like a security thing. But Galtung says that these killings are unjustified. So yeah, it's good that he's pointing out that it can come from multiple different sources. So let's see. Yeah, he goes pretty deep into saying that if you want to understand the Taliban, you need to understand Afghanistan. Afghanistan's a very decentralized country. There's 25,000 autonomous little villages and around 6 to 8 nations within Afghanistan, depending on how you count it. So it's a country that is extremely like culturally complex, and they have these like tribal relations that go back thousands of years, way before any of these countries' borders were ever set down. So that's just like a really important thing to recognize and like understand when you're trying to understand a lot of this terrorism that comes out of out of that area. Galtung goes on to say that it's a very Muslim country. They hate secularism. They hate people coming in, trying to win hearts and minds by digging wells and giving them water not blessed by Allah. To win heart. So, I mean, that was obviously like just trying to be like impactful, that statement. But it's like this whole idea of like our Western strategies of like peace building and stuff like that. They're just that. They're Western strategies. He said that secular peace building activities are non-starters when it comes to like um when like securing peace in that region. Sorry about that. So let's see. So also the Taliban in Afghanistan are, yeah, he said they're sick and tired of being invaded. Starts with Alexander the Great, and then by the Mongols, 3 times by the Britons, once by the Soviets. Then 9/11 happens, and they're being invaded by U.S. coalition NATO forces. So for them, this is also a war, a fight. What did I write? This is also a war to fight being invaded. He says in quotes, a war to end wars. You should definitely also talk about the Durand Line that was drawn by the British Empire through Pashtun territory. Actually, you don't have to talk about this, but it's just a good example of how like the West inserting itself and trying to be like, okay, we're gonna make this whole land great, just like we have just now. Let us draw some boundaries and like ruin some like ancient tribal like areas. So those were a bunch of my suggestions for your proposed paragraph. It was like the third paragraph in. I think you said you wanted to touch on a few different points. She goes on to, I keep referring to you as she, and then I like refer to you as you, but you get it. She goes on to provide a global perspective of terrorism, discussing its use as a tactic towards a larger objective, and contrasting it to the view that many Americans who only view it as a recent phenomenon since 9/11, based on Islamic fundamentalism. Discussing its use as a tactic towards a larger objective, and contrasting it to the view that many Americans who only view it as a recent phenomenon since 9/11, based on Islamic fundamentalism. I don't know. Okay. I think your definition of terrorism as a tactic towards a greater goal, as contrasted with the concept of the war on terrorism, is convincing. I liked that one a lot. I know this is just like random, but if you want to talk about other examples of terrorists that aren't like painted as evil as Middle Eastern or like Islamic fundamentalist terrorists, you could definitely use Pablo Escobar. He's like kind of has almost been revitalized by this show Narcos, and as almost like a little bit of a hero. Like the show is stylizing his entire reign, but he was a terrorist. The show does show that, like, no one's like smoothing that over. But can you imagine there ever being a successful TV show about like a Middle Eastern terrorist, like in the West, like a show that's successful in the West? Like, I don't think so. And so this man was a terrorist. He blew up an airplane. He set off a bomb in a public square. Yet we have this thing in American pop culture where like everyone's dressing up as Pablo Escobar for Halloween and stuff like that. And it's also interesting because he resorted towards acts of terrorism. The more desperate he got, like the more he lost control of his cartel and stuff like that. Like that was his way of almost lashing out. So that could be another example if you want to use like something about how that form of terrorism is seen as much less severe in American mainstream media. I mean, I still watch the show. I thought the show was great, but it's like we're so quick to categorize this one type of terrorism coming out of one specific region that we overlook that terrorism is not just restricted to one people. Megan also makes the case that terrorists who commit acts in the name of Islam are misinterpreting the teachings of Islam to justify their acts. She goes on to examine the meanings of the word jihad, which Americans universally take to mean holy warrior. In fact, it has less violent connotations in the Quran, which she points out with several compelling quotes from the Quran. I'm definitely glad that you did this. Definitely glad that you have the part about the Quran. And like, while obviously I will never, like, I can't understand the full teachings of the Quran in one paragraph, I can go on for hours, like, ranting about the situation in the Middle East. And like, I couldn't tell you one tenet of the teaching of Islam. You're saying that you talk about how Islamophobia has caused us to accept a war on terror. that is essentially a war on Muslim culture. I think that was a really good point. Definitely. I like that point a lot. And yeah, you can go further with that. So like this is how we fight on the ground, and then this is how we're fighting the war at home, through like perpetuating this idea of Islamophobia, almost similar to like propaganda efforts during World War II, except now it's taken a much more hateful spin. You're essentially saying that we're so far removed from the situation in the Middle East that in effect, we feel as if we have have an obligation to combat multiculturalism and Islam in particular. This is like very convenient in separating Westerners from the other. I think you could also talk about Bacevich in his piece. He goes into depth talking about this like war works mentality that has been going on since, I think like World War II. Yeah, World War II brought great prosperity for Americans. So many Americans see our involvement in the Middle East as a continuation of the moral victory of the 20th century. Bacevich also describes the revisionist project and how it is important for Americans to recognize these facts. So yeah, you could look into that if you wanted more. Also, just for like some last suggestions, if you wanted to talk about drone strikes as like a tactic that we're using in the war on terror. The technology is also, with the technology conversation, you could talk about mass surveillance in as far as like how that perpetuates Islamophobia, as it casts such a wide net. So yeah, if you want to see terrorism as a tactic towards a greater goal, you can contrast it with our version of the war on terror and talk more about civilians killed in drone strikes. There's also a good Washington Post article that you should look up. If you just look up like ISIS sons in Syria, I didn't have time to look it up, but the article is about how there's some Syrians in America that are literally telling their relatives and stuff back home not to call them because their son was just taken in by the FBI because they thought that he was trying to go to Syria and join ISIS. So like the article explains it much better than I can, but there's this like fear and paranoia of these minorities in America. And so yeah, the vast majority of Muslims are peaceful and moderate, but moderate Muslims are afraid to speak out. And that is a huge problem. And that, yeah, overall, I thought the paper was great. It was well written. There's a few typos that I saw, and I can give you all my information. It's really, really scatterbrained the way I presented it, but I can send it to you if you want. But like other than that, it was really organized. It had a good hierarchy of information. But it was a good paper. I think you took on a very, very, very big topic. Maybe just a few more like examples to support your premises, but other than that, it's a great paper.